Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is that you're watching this, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we start this time, as we like to do whenever we can, with some good news, a few bits of good news. First up is that another attempt to get the Supreme Court to gut Obamacare has ended the way the previous two attempts did, in failure. On June 17th, the Supreme Court left the law intact, ruling 7-2 that Texas and the rest of the cabal of right-wing states that brought the suit don't have standing to bring it because they haven't shown any way in which they were or would be harmed by the provisions of law that they were challenging. Now, Obamacare is clearly inadequate to the task to which it's been set, and in many ways it's a public subsidy of the private health insurance industry. And in fact, frankly, even Medicare for All is insufficient. The only thing that would suffice is a true national health care system. But despite all that, Obamacare, for all its flaws, is still better than what we had before. So it's good news that it survived another murder attempt. Next up, on June 16th, the Department of Education issued an updated interpretation of Title IX, the law that protects students from sex-based discrimination in government-funded, federally funded schools. They determined that this law does apply to LGBTQ students. The department cited the Supreme Court decision Bostock v. Clayton, a 2020 case that found that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which protects employees against discrimination, does apply to matters of sexual orientation and gender identity. So the Education Department figured if the Civil Rights Act applies to LGBTQ employees, then Title IX should apply to LGBTQ students. Now, there's still a very, very long way to go on this. 2021 has been a miserable year for LGBTQ people in general. 33 states have introduced more than 100 bills to attack transgender rights, with Texas and Tennessee vying to see who can be the worst. Transgender youth have been a particular target. 31 states have introduced bills that would bar transgender athletes from participating in school sports consistent with their gender identity, and such bills have already become law in Florida and Tennessee. And in addition to that, there are other proposals that actually would hinder or even ban medical professionals from offering transition assistance to transgender youth. So this reaffirmation of federal law, Title IX, and rejection of the Tweety Pie era interpretation of it, it's quite welcome. Finally, for now, under good news, reality winner has been released from prison to a halfway house. Now, you may not have heard of Reality Winner, or maybe you forgot about her, but Reality Winner, who is possessor of one of the world's great names, right up there with Zephyr Teachout, Reality Winner is a whistleblower who was charged with espionage after she gave a secret document about Russian attempts to hack the U.S. election system to a reporter at the progressive journal, The Intercept. In 2018, she agreed to a plea deal involving a 5-year sentence, the remainder of which she will now serve in the halfway house or perhaps even in home confinement. So while good news, this is still a sad thing because, in fact, she should not be in prison at all, and Blodden should immediately pardon her. Because this case actually is not about espionage, it's not about national security. Ultimately, what it's about is the extreme politicization of leaks. And leaks something that advanced the interests of the current administration, whatever it is. And not only do you face no problem, you probably did it with a wink and a nod blessing. Leak something that challenges that interest, you could call it a spy, like Reality Winner was. All right, moving on. Next, I have an update on something I talked about last time. Israel has a new government. Opponents of the now former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, cobbled together a coalition of 8 small and mid-sized parties to form a 61-59 majority in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. Naftali Bennett, a former Netanyahu ally, will hold the office of Prime Minister for the first 2 years of the term, after which Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, the architect of the coalition, will assume the post. assuming that a coalition with deep ideological differences, which is united only by their mutual dislike for Netanyahu, could actually last that long. The Palestinians, for their part, mostly dismissed the change in the government, saying it would really make no difference. In the words of a government worker in Gaza, there is no difference between one Israeli leader and another. They are good or bad for their nation. When it comes to us, they are all bad. They have good cause for their pessimism. Bennett has placed the blame for the conflict entirely on the Palestinians, even claiming that they do not even recognize the existence of Israel, which is an outright lie. Bennett said very little about Palestinians in a speech he gave before being sworn in. He did say violence will be met with a firm response, and added that, then quoting, security calm will lead to economic moves, which will lead to reducing friction and the conflict. Which frankly very easily translates to saying to the Palestinians, just submit. Don't give us any trouble. Go along with whatever we want, and maybe over time we'll be somewhat nicer to you. In other words, just submit to the status quo. A status quo which for Palestinians involves expanding Jewish settlements in the West Bank, done by every Israeli government since 1967 and sure to be continued by this one. A status quo of looming evictions in Jerusalem, home demolitions, deadly shootings, and an array of discriminatory measures that two internationally recognized human rights groups have called apartheid. And in Gaza, which has been under crippling sanctions since 2007 and has been accurately called the world's largest outdoor prison, it's even worse. You know, as if to make the point, the day after being sworn in, this new government approved a parade by Israeli ultra-nationalists through East Jerusalem, a parade consisting of Israeli right-wing yahoos shouting things like "death to Arabs" and "may your village burn." Now, police did keep the march from going through the Damascus Gate into Palestinian neighborhoods, but they did clear Palestinians from the area and from the center of the old city so the bigots could march undisturbed. Now, in response to this, some incendiary balloons were released from Gaza, causing some fires in open fields in southern Israel, with no reports of damage or casualties, which Israel, with its typical measured response, responded to by bombing Gaza. Meanwhile, the United States, us, we are still supporting this illegal apartheid and illegal occupation with over $10 million a day in military aid, including a pledge to replenish what Israel used during its recent war on Gaza, all while we mouth platitudes about how much we believe in peace and a settlement and justice and how we can be a fair broker in negotiations. The truth is, if we really want to advance justice in that conflict, if we really want to do it, the best thing we could do to advance peace and justice in the area is to end all military aid to Israel and remove all our diplomatic backing of Israel. The fact that that notion is just, it's inconceivable. It's completely off the table. It's just absolutely not. That actually shows the hypocrisy in our claims to support justice. By the way, a quick sidebar here with everything you need to know, which is occasional feature about something where you can learn a lot about something in a very short time, usually no more than a couple of sentences. In this case, it's everything you need to know in a single mental image. I told you about that march through East Jerusalem. Now, I want you to imagine what the reaction of the Israeli police, the Israeli government, would be to a march of Palestinians through Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem shouting "death to Jews." What do you think would be the official, the police, the military response? What do you think the reaction would be here in Congress, in the White House? How long would it be before there were denunciations of all Palestinians because of this? Just imagine what that reaction would be. And that's everything you need to know. All right, now something else about relating to hypocrisy. The hypocrisy about withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, one thing is that it was always assumed, it was always avowed that this withdrawal would still allow for airstrikes for counterterrorism. The thing is, they would be from what's called over the horizon, which means they're in the vicinity, but they're not actually based in the country. In these cases, such over-the-horizon strikes would come from existing U.S. Air Force bases in Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. In other words, what we're really talking about here is turning Afghanistan into another one of our drone wars, like the ones in Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen, and in the past involved places like Iraq and Syria and Libya. In other words, we're not so much talking about actual withdrawal as we are as being able to continue the killing just without any risk to U.S. forces, and so without any domestic opposition, because after all, if no Americans are being killed, what do we care? The Pentagon is looking for $10 billion in this year's military budget for those operations. But it's all for counterterrorism, and we're all in favor of counterterrorism. How could you not be? Except it turns out that counterterrorism has a rather flexible definition. The Pentagon is seeking authorization to carry out strikes as direct air support of Afghan forces if Kabul or another major city is thought to be in danger of falling to the Taliban. This is because come July, the Afghan military, which was created, trained, and supplied in the image of the American military, the Afghan military is supposed to start defending the country on its own. And after 19 years of blood and billions, the Pentagon is not at all sure they can do it. In fact, they offered only that an immediate collapse of the Afghan army is not a foregone conclusion. And how's that for a ringing endorsement? So what we really want to do here, what they want to do, is simply to redefine direct air support of the Afghan military as counterterrorism. And so our endless war is actually not ending. All right, one more thing that we can file under the heading of hypocrisy. Joe Biden insists that he is opposed to the death penalty and has pledged to seek an end to the federal death penalty. But he won't say how he's going to do this or when he's going to do this. Although, in fact, he could do it essentially with a stroke of the pen by simply commuting any federal death penalty that arises, simply commuting that to life in prison. And his authority to do this is beyond question. There's simply no question about it. Now, admittedly, that would not be a permanent end, but at least it would put an end to anything during his administration. But the fact is, given the chance, he has not only failed to act to stop a federal death sentence, he's pushing for one to continue. Last year, the First Circuit Court of Appeals threw out the death sentence imposed on the Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. This is over concerns about the jury selection failing to take into account potential bias on the part of jurors. Now, note that this decision does not overturn Tsarnaev's conviction, just the death sentence. This would mean going back to the original court for a new penalty phase trial. Which, in fact, you should note that it could be that you do a new penalty phase trial with a properly non-biased jury and still come up with a death sentence at the end of it. But no matter. On June 15th, the Department of Justice, Joe Biden's Department of Justice, Merrick Garland's Department of Justice, urged the U.S. Supreme Court to simply overrule the appeals court decision and reinstate the death penalty for Tsarnaev without going through a new penalty phase trial. And so much for opposing the death penalty. In March, when the Supreme Court agreed to take the case, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said Biden has, quoting her, grave concerns about whether capital punishment as currently implemented is consistent with the values that are fundamental to our sense of justice and fairness, which apparently actually came with the unspoken footnote of just don't expect them to ever do anything about it. By the way, included here, strictly for comparison, Tsarnaev and his brother killed 3 people. He wounded over 200 others, but killed 3 people with their bomb. In the U.S., this year, between January 1st and May 31st, in this year, there have been an average of almost 12 mass shootings a week. 14 people killed on average a week, not just from guns, but from mass shootings this year. And the year is not even half over. Okay, moving on now to another one of my persistent obsessions, the fact that we are uninformed, malinformed, and misinformed by our major mass mainstream news media. I argued about this some years ago with a friend who said she wasn't concerned about bias in the news because she said, I think what I think, not what I'm told to think. And he said, the thing is, though, that's really true. The news media can't control what you think, but it can have a significant influence on what you think about, on what is more important than other things, what event is more important than another event, and how those events are interpreted. Now, as part of all this, there's something that I have noticed over the years, and I'm doing this to urge you to watch for this in the future. To the media, you probably know this, probably notice this. The media likes to force everything into a framework of Democrat versus Republican, Dem versus Gopper. Even if the thing is not directly political, they'll address it in terms of how this will affect the political fortunes of the two major parties. And the thing is, in discussing those fortunes, whatever it is, whatever the issue, whatever the development, it's astonishing how often in the view of the news media it's seen as good news for the right wing or a challenge for the left. It's good for the GOP. It's a problem for the Democrats. Now, this is not a deliberate conscious bias. I'm not asserting that. I'm not asserting any conscious shaping of the news to a certain agenda, but there are unconscious biases that shape the perception. Biases that are in favor of the powerful over the powerless, of the status quo over change, for official sources over unofficial sources. And part of that bias in favor of the status quo, it produces a bias in favor of the right wing, which is the voice of the status quo. And what I have here is an example of this to illustrate it. There was a recent poll that was released. The figures are up here. There's a recent poll which presented people with a list of issues asking about each of them, is this a very big problem for the U.S.? It reported what percentage of respondents said yes, it was a very big problem, and then compared the results of the same question from a year ago. Okay, an article covering this poll. I'm quoting the lead of it. More Americans now say violent crime is a very big problem in the U.S. and say the same thing about COVID-19. A shift that suggests policing and public safety could come to dominate U.S. politics as the pandemic subsides, potentially putting the Biden administration and Democratic leaders on the defensive. In other words, this shift is good news for the right wing. Thing is, look at the numbers. Now, you may not be able to read the words. I'm not sure how clearly this comes out. But the bars here, okay, the top one is the COVID, change in COVID response. The violent crime one is the third bar. Now, you notice that concern about COVID has dropped considerably, which is entirely reasonable, that COVID, the concern has dropped since last summer. But note, the concern about violent crime has not changed. It went from 48 to 49, but with a 3% margin of error, that means that there's no change. It's a dead heat. But because more folks now think that violent crime is a serious issue than think COVID is a serious issue, that's good news for the right. But here's the thing. Same figures, same information. You could look at those figures and interpret it this way, saying that reduced concern about COVID, it could have been interpreted as an opening for Democrats. An opening for Democrats to present themselves as problem solvers, as having dealt successfully with the pandemic, as having managed a crisis effectively and consistently. But the media can't see it that way. The media can't see it that way. To them, it just means what? Violent crime comes to the fore. Whenever you talk about crime, of course, that's advantage right wing, always. Here's another example from the same article, still talking about this business about crime. And again, I'm quoting the article here. Just 27% of Americans say law enforcement is too tough on most offenders. Half say the current levels of law enforcement are either not tough enough, 32%, or about right, 18%. So what they do is they say just 27 versus half. But look at the same figures, the same numbers. You could have presented it this way. Despite continuing concern about violent crime, a clear plurality of Americans, by 45 to 32, say there's no need for police to be tougher. But it was not presented that way. Meanwhile, in asking people who say violent crime is increasing, which not everybody did, in fact it is, but compared to the levels of the 1990s, it's still way, way lower. But they asked people who say violent crime is increasing, who they blame. Again, quoting the article, more blame the racial justice movement itself, 57%, then blame joblessness, 44%, systemic racism, 40%, or the pandemic, 35%. And this is presented here with a shameful lack or even a hint of self-awareness of how those numbers might have been influenced by how the racial justice protests were covered by the media. A media with a bias for official sources, which in this case would be police sources, nor even the impact of the well-known, long-acknowledged bias of the media, particularly the TV and cable news media, in favor of drama and conflict over reality and context. There's an old newspaper saying that, and it's still used, expressed now as, if it bleeds, it leads. I encourage you to keep an eye out for the good news for the right interpretation of events. I think you'll be surprised how often it appears. All right, I wanted to make sure I got this in because we have a clown award. And we just have the winner, no other nominees, because frankly, there is no point in looking at other nominees. This could easily be the clown of the year. The winner is the man who put the Gohmert in Gohmert, Representative Louis Gohmert of Texas. At a June 8th hearing of the House Natural Resources Committee, he put this question to Jennifer Eberlein, the Assistant Deputy Chief of the National Forest System. Quoting, I was informed by the immediate past director of NASA that they found that the moon's orbit is changing slightly, and so is the Earth's orbit around the sun. We know there's been significant solar flare activities, and so is there anything the National Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management can do to change the course of the moon's orbit or the Earth's orbit around the sun? Obviously, that would have a profound effect on our climate. And apparently this is not sarcastic. He was serious about this. Louis Gohmert was actually raising the idea of changing the orbit of the Earth in order to deal with climate change. He's hands down the Clown Award winner. In fact, very possibly this is the Clown of the Year. Now, quick science aside here, just a thing, to show how a little knowledge like Gohmert's is a dangerous thing. It is true the moon's orbit is changing slightly. That has to do with interaction with the tides on Earth. And Earth's orbit around the sun is subject to some, for lack of a better term, wobbling. Those cyclical shifts in the Earth's motion and the resulting change in its position relative to the sun can be a driver of long-term climate change, including such things like triggering the beginning or the end of glaciation periods or ice ages. Thing is, those cycles run on time frames ranging from 24,000 to over 100,000 years. And the warming we are now seeing is from a time frame of just over 100 years. These cycles and the warming we're seeing have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And Louis Gohmert really, really, really is a clown. All right, that's going to be it for now. I'm going to end. I've got a few things that I want to say. For a string of very personal reasons, the Erickson Report is going on hiatus. I have absolutely no idea for how long. I don't know when we'll be together again. I do hope to return, if nothing else, at least from time to time with some, let's say, special reports, where I would spend a major topic like healthcare or something and spend the entire show on one topic. There are certainly a number of topics that deserve that kind of thing. One that I really have not, things I could have talked about today, even just today. The military budget. Joe Biden just came in with an actual increase in the military budget. What's in the budget? What are alternatives? How could it be changed? In fact, I may even pull out something I did a long, long time ago about nonviolent national defense, about defending a nation without the use of an army. We face threats from numerous sources. We face threats to our privacy, both from government and from corporate interest. Right now, we are facing serious threats to our right to vote. We are facing serious threats, and this has been not even addressed as much as the voting issue, serious threats to our right to protest. There are serious threats to the right to an abortion. We're facing a bunch of, and any one of those could easily be the topic for an entire show. There are international issues. There's Yemen, there's Myanmar. And of course, there's climate change. And of course, I could actually do a whole show of and another thing, which is where we have some talk about fun, cool science stuff. So I'm hoping to at least to do some special reports. But for the moment, we are taking an extended break. And again, I don't know how long it's going to be. If you have anything to say, any responses, anything you want to say to me, you know how to get in touch with me. It's been up here, you know. whoviating@AOL.com is my personal email. whoviating.blogspot.com is my website, my blog. But for the moment, I'll leave that to you. Again, anything you have to say to me, please feel free to say it. But for now, thank you for watching. Thank you for your support. Thank you for being with us. I will see you again at some point. But for now, I'll just have to say, until then, you have the best time you can. You do the best you can. Live the best you can. Save your life the best you can. And as always, peace.